In this video, we're going to take a look at how to enable ray tracing to get true reflections and refractions and ray trace shadows in our scene. With our still life scene, which is still life version 4 in your lighting project, this is the render that we get. This has Maya software rendering it set to production quality, which gives us a nice render. The Hypershade will show you the shaders that are put onto these objects. Let's go ahead and select one of these, this apple. We'll go to Window, Rendering Editors, Hypershade, and when that window opens up, we'll go ahead and click this icon to see what shader's on there. Now, there's only one shader for everything in our scene, which is a blend. We select that and go into the attribute editor by double-clicking it or pressing Control or Command A. We'll see that there is a Ray Trace Options rollout window. This heading allows you to introduce refractions into your scene. Also, up in the specular shading, you have a reflectivity and a reflected color. Now, the reflections will not show up in Maya because ray tracing is not enabled. If we want the reflections, we'll have to turn on ray tracing in the render settings window, which we can do in the ray tracing quality section simply by turning it on. These values control how many reflections will iterate in your scene. Reflections set to 10 is fairly high, and it's pretty good, and it's good for production quality. The shader also will control how many reflections you see. If you open up the attribute editor for the shader, you'll see under Ray Trace Options, limits for the refraction and limits for the reflection. It's set to 1, which will allow you to see one reflection. I'm going to go ahead and save this in the buffer. With ray tracing turned on, I'm going to render this scene. Should take just a little bit longer, but you'll see immediately reflections, giving you a much better idea that these are glossy surfaces. The difference between the reflection limit of 1 and, let's say, a reflection limit of 4 can be seen in this apple. We'll go ahead and save this in the buffer, and we'll render this again. You can see, we'll go ahead and zoom into this area. The reflection limit allows you to see reflections of reflections in your primary reflection. So you can see there's a little bit of a difference in the other fruit that you see reflected in the apple. And it gives you a slightly more real look in your renders to have more reflection bounces. That is controlled in two places. That is in the shader with the reflection limit, and globally in the ray tracing quality in the render settings. If this is set to 1, this will override the reflection limit set in the shader. We'll put this in the buffer, we'll render this out. Keeping in mind, in the render settings, we set a reflection limit down to 1. And you'll notice that our apple has gone back to being a little bit duller in the reflections. So when setting your reflections, make sure that you set your limits in both the render setting and the shader itself. Now we'll take a look at creating a refraction. We're going to take this blend. Let me clear everything in the work area. I'm going to copy this blend by selecting it and going to Edit, Duplicate Shading Network. This blend I'm going to assign to our apple, to this guy right there. Go ahead and right click and select Assign Material to Selection. And this blend, I'm going to create a transparency on it. Let's go to a fairly transparent object. Now I have reflections turned on through ray tracing. If I render this out, our apple will tend to kind of disappear. We'll still see some of its reflections in there, so it has a little bit of a glass quality. But to get more of a glass quality, we're going to want to create a refraction. That is the physical light photons bending when they go from one density of medium, like air, into another density of medium, like glass or water, and so forth. This is controlled in the shader's attributes. If we open up the shader's attribute editor, we've already created transparency by making the transparency a bit more white. If we go down to the ray trace options, we can turn on refractions. What's important with a refraction is the refractive index. This is also known as the index of refraction, or IOR. The index of refraction, or the refractive index, is 1 by default, which means there is no palpable refraction. You don't really see anything, so you need to adjust that number. Typically, you don't want to go very far, so we'll go to 1.1 for the refractive index. We'll go ahead and put our previous render in our buffer, and we'll go and render just this region to take a look at what a refractive index of 1.1 does to our apple. And you'll see immediately that you've got a much glassier look at it. Let's go ahead and take our camera and zoom in to the apple so we see a lot more of it in the render. Let's run this render. Let's turn off the region and render the whole frame. And you'll really start to see refractions happening inside. If we change the refractive index to 0.9, let's go below 1 this time. Save this in the buffer and render this apple again. You'll notice that the objects refracting through this glass are now smaller. When you go lower on your refractive index, you'll tend to shrink down the objects behind that glass surface. That gives you a nice look right there. Just like the reflection limit is controlled in 2 different locations, in the render settings, as well as in the shader itself. If I reduce the refraction limit down to 1, save this in the buffer and render this out, you'll notice that the refraction will leave quite a lot to be desired. Because this object, the apple, has certainly 2 sides, the front side and the back side, which requires at least a refraction limit of 2, if not more, to get a more glass surface out of it. You'll see that this is a refraction limit of 2, and this was a refraction limit of 6, allowing other parts of the scene to refract through glass, giving you a slightly better refraction. One other thing that turning on ray tracing does is allows our light to have ray trace shadows. So if we take a look at our render, let's go ahead and back our camera out to what we had before. Take a look at one of our original renders. You'll see that our primary shadow is being cast from the left, meaning it is from our key light, which would be this guy. We'll see in the shadow parameters for the light that it is set to depth map shadows. We'll turn off depth map shadows. These render whether you have ray tracing turned on or not. And we will go to the use ray trace shadows. This gives us a better shadow, a cleaner shadow, and a more accurate shadow. You'll notice under our glass object that the shadow for the glass apple is a solid shadow. This is unfortunate and is part of using depth map shadows. Let's go ahead and get rid of the large apple renders. Okay. The ray trace shadows will account for transparency in the object and create a shadow that is much more indicative of a glass object. Furthermore, you'll get nice clean edges with a ray trace shadow as well. Our depth map was turned up to a pretty high resolution, so those are clean as well. Except the one thing that we can do is we can create soft shadows with ray tracing as well. And that is governed by the shadow rays and the light radius. Let's create a light radius of, let's say, 4, and we'll create shadow rays of 8. The shadow rays govern the quality of the softness of the shadows. Put this in the buffer. The higher your light radius, the softer and more fall off that you'll get off of your shadows. Now we'll see that light radius of 4 is a little bit too high. I'm going to hit escape to stop that render. We'll go to light radius, a more modest radius of, let's go to 0.8 actually. We'll keep shadow rays at 1 for right now so we can see the noise. And with ray tracing enabled, you'll see you'll get a softness, but it's really, really dirty and very ugly with that noise. Let's turn our shadow rays back up to 8, save that in the buffer, and render this out. You'll incur a little bit more of a render time penalty, but you'll get shadows that are much softer and much more real. With a higher rays, you'll get cleaner shadows. So remove this. And this is the advantage of using ray trace shadows with light radius turned up over a depth map shadow. And all of this revolves around turning ray tracing on in the render settings. In this video, we took a look at reflections, refractions, and ray trace shadows when turning on ray tracing in the render settings.